Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan McKenzie, CEO at the Emergency Services Foundation. On behalf of our chair, Patrick Kidd, the board members who pretty much are all with us tonight, the ESF Scholarship Committee, chaired by Inspector Craig Shepherd from VicPol, I'd like to welcome you all to this showcase of the Emergency Management Conference of the scholarship people. So for many years, our scholarship awardees have presented their study findings to the board, to the heads of agency and invited guests over a really fancy lunch in the setting of Raheen. One of the benefits of a COVID-induced new ways of working is that we can involve so many more people this way, and I believe something like 200 people have registered for this event tonight. The downside is we can't provide you a cocktail. I'm sorry about that. Nevertheless, sit back, relax with your beverage of choice. It's G&T hour as far as I'm concerned. No one can see your slippers or your tracky dacks, so you're safe. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on behalf of all of us. Pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging as we showcase how four people with great curiosity have contributed to the collective wisdom of the sector. A little background on the ESF scholarships, because I know you won't all be familiar with them. ESF has provided around 144 scholarships since its inception. That's pretty much every year except this year because of the travel restrictions. In fact, one of the very first scholarship recipients is now our Inspector General for Emergency Management and ESF board member Tony Pearce. All of those people are considered alumni, and like Tony, many have gone on to really impressive emergency management careers. In 2019, we started to shift the focus of our scholarships so that they align more closely to our purpose, and that is to help improve mental health and well-being for people across the sector, including those who have retired. So the people that you're going to hear from today each identified a topic of interest to them that the selection committee determined would add value to the sector. They planned a study tour. They travelled around the world to different places to meet some very hospitable people. They wrote a report which their head of agency has considered and responded to. They've also met with Andrew Crisp, the Emergency Services Commissioner, so he could discuss their learnings. It's been quite a journey. Now it's your turn to hear all about how ESF scholarships have a real impact, not only on the awardees, but how they can inform and improve how we do things. They're each going to explain why they chose their area of study, how they went about getting information, what they found, and most importantly, how they've shared and used that knowledge that they've gained. I know you'll have questions for them, and I'll do my best to coordinate those. And I'd ask you to please type them in the Q&A box, and I'll get to those. So we might begin with Senior Sergeant Greg Dean from Victoria Police. Greg's now in charge of Glen Waverley Police Station, and he's actually on duty tonight, but was a member of the VicPol Wellbeing Services team when he undertook this work. Greg's passionate about mental health and wellbeing, and he is an exemplar in leading for better mental health. Greg understands very well how vital it is to get help early to prevent serious mental illness. He studied holistic wellbeing programs, think health retreats, we'd all like a bit of that at the moment, to consider how something like that could be used for emergency management people at risk of mental illness. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Susan. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great opportunity to explain the honour that I had of the scholarship the ESF gave me. And I just wanted to start off with a bit of a personal story as to how I found myself here today. And it probably started back in mid-2016. Then I started off in a role as the Senior Sergeant at Victoria Police's Welfare Services. And I'd come from the previous 3 to 4 years as a senior sergeant at a number of inner city police stations, where part of my role included providing support and looking after the health and well-being of my staff. I then took up the role at Welfare Services, as I said, in mid-2016. And what really shocked me and what really set me back a bit was I'd gone from at a station where I essentially had an overview of the staff directly under my control to a point when I started at Welfare Services, I started essentially having a helicopter view over the entire organisation. And I must admit, I was nowhere near prepared or ready to accept what I found when I looked across the whole organisation. The organisation itself, from a mental health perspective, was absolutely mind-blowing. It blew my socks off. So I knew then that I had to do something about it. Not just myself, but it's something that I wanted to be proactive about. I knew that early intervention was the main aim in the mental health space. So back then I started off submitting an application for a Churchill Fellowship, which I was lucky enough to be granted in 2017. And I travelled around the world in 2018 doing a lot of research into early intervention into mental health and policing. Part of that fellowship landed me in Harrogate in the United Kingdom, where I spent a few days at an establishment known as the Police Treatment Centre. Some of you may be aware or may recall from last year's Emergency Management Conference, we had the privilege of hearing from the CEO of the Police Treatment Centre, Mr. Patrick Cairns. The days I spent at the Police Treatment Centre, which is a residential wellbeing centre, really opened my eyes to a different form of wellbeing support for staff, because I was used to the model that we had back in Victoria Police mainly being focused around clinical support. So it was from that Churchill Fellowship where I then got a real passion for looking further into holistic therapies, which then led me to meeting Susan and then being given the absolute honour in 2019 in making an application and being successful to do some research into holistic programs for early intervention to try and prevent, across the emergency services sector, people sustaining a mental health injury. So the purpose of my whole research was essentially to try and establish what best practice was in the area of holistic wellbeing retreats. And although I wasn't able to find a specific retreat for the emergency services sector, what I did find, and what part of my research when I was designing my agenda, was to try and find retreats that had experience and proven success when treating emergency service personnel. I was then able to get an agenda together where I travelled into Queensland and New South Wales late last year, where I spent some time, and I was very lucky to be invited into the environments of 4 different retreats. All 4 of them had previously treated emergency service workers. All 4 of them, when I attended, currently had emergency service workers within the retreats. And I also got given the opportunity to have a lot of lengthy discussions with emergency service personnel who'd been through the programs, and I was able to get a really, really good learned experience and a life experience discussion with them, which was invaluable. Out of my report, I came back from that and I put my report together, and I came up with some significant findings and some recommendations that I tabled in my report. Those findings, basically there was 4 or 5 of those, and the findings I came up with after doing my research is that the location and the environment of these retreats is absolutely vital. All the retreats I went to were in idyllic rural locations that just provided a really atmosphere for the retreat to occur. The retreats were to be wholly holistically focused with some clinical assistance as well. But the idea and the thing that really resonated with me about the holistic features of these retreats was it enables you to educate and provide people with lifelong skills and strategies that they can utilise in their everyday life once they've finished at the retreat. A further finding was that for us in the emergency services sector to get the best out of this type of retreat was to make it sector specific. We know as emergency service agencies that confidentiality is something that we treat very, very seriously, and a lot of staff historically have decided not to report their mental illness and around the stigma of help seeking, around their concerns of confidentiality. We also needed to establish a funding stream that made sure that the retreat program was viable long term. And we also saw it would be very important to engage with the work cover insurers, particularly seeing we were looking at this in relation to an early intervention model for some financial support. The recommendations that came out of my report include that we develop a pilot program based on the research and the best practice that I was able to establish both in my Emergency Services Foundation scholarship as well as my Churchill Fellowship. That the program be tailored for the needs of the emergency services sector, which is vitally important, obviously. That the work cover insurers be engaged and requested to provide us support during the pilot program. I think it's really, really important that the pilot programs, when conducted, are independently evaluated so we can establish how we're tracking in relation to the best practice and how we're addressing the issues we're aiming to. And that evaluation directs us in the long term around a sustainable wellbeing retreat for emergency services. So that's where the importance of the evaluation comes in. So that's essentially my findings and my recommendations. And I just wanted to finish off with where am I now? I'm extremely excited where I've got to since I returned from my scholarship last year in December. I am a member of a sector-wide working group that we've put together that the members of that working group are almost from across all the agencies in the emergency services sector. And through that working group, we've been able to put together a concept paper, which is being presented in only a couple of weeks to both the ESF board and a stakeholder council. I hold my fingers crossed for this, but what I'm really, really excited about is I know from my research that if we can pull this off and we're able to establish a retreat for emergency services only, not only will we be an Australian first, but I'm very, very confident that we will become a world first and a world leader in this form of therapy for emergency service workers. So I've really got my hopes pinned on this, and I think we can do some great work.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Thank you. Could I just suggest maybe that you tell people a little bit about the concept that working group has come up with?
So what we're looking at is one of the first things I mentioned in relation to our findings was establishing a location that's going to work. That concept paper we've worked, part of the working group has been working on a program, a schedule, which we've been able to put together that deals with all the different types of holistic therapies that we've been able to establish, are proven from best practice. And we're looking at some pilot programs in the vicinity of 10 to 12 days in length. We're going to be inviting participants on a voluntary basis from across the entire emergency services sector so that they can participate in those pilot programs. At this stage, we're looking at trying to conduct possibly 6 pilot programs, and there are also considerations in relation to involving family members and significant others in the program as well.
Okay, so when we say volunteering, for the pilot program, we're actually thinking of people while they're on leave, aren't we?
Correct. Just for the pilot program at this stage, and discussions I've had with a number of my colleagues within Victoria Police, and that was a discussion that we had when we were discussing this. Would that inhibit people willing to volunteer for 12 days, whether they'd be prepared to do it in their own time? But discussions I've had with plenty of my colleagues is that that would provide no barrier whatsoever.
Okay, I've got a question here from Erin Smith. She said, thanks, Greg. This is an incredibly important and innovative contribution. My question is whether you would envisage different types of retreats based on whether emergency services personnel are needing early intervention prevention or more restorative rehabilitative support for those with long-term mental injury.
I think the answer to that is that we're focusing at the moment on early intervention. We all know that the early intervention component of mental health is vitally important because it's about giving the worker, the employee, the best possible opportunity of having better health. But we know that returning to better health quicker and earlier means a quicker return to work. So the focus of this pilot program is to target early intervention more so than historical.
And then I've got a question from Michelle Critchley at the CFA. Thanks, Greg. Do we have access to any of your recommendations? I think it's important, Michelle, to say that there are people from the CFA involved in this program and working with us through the Learning Network, and that would be Suzanne Leckie. But Greg's report is actually on the ESF website.
And it's important to note too, Susan, that this obviously includes volunteers as well. It's not just to paid employees, it's across the entire sector. It's volunteer workers as well.
That's right. Now, if anybody's got any other questions for Greg, we can come back to those later at the end of the session. But I might now say thank you, Greg. Great work, and it's a really fantastic example of how scholarships are helping us inform the work of the ESF and the collaboration that we're doing across the sector in developing this concept further. So now I'm going to introduce T. Hopkins from Australian Red Cross. So T was interested to learn from the process of reunification in the UK, where we know there's been significant mass casualty events, and they've recently caused distressed family and friends to seek the whereabouts and safety of potential victims. Most importantly, T was interested in how this work impacts those who manage reunification through witnessing the impact it had on people here undertaking this sort of work in natural disasters and other significant events. So T, please tell us about your scholarship experience.
Thanks, Susan. And thank you to ESF for allowing me to have this amazing opportunity in receiving this scholarship. It was a pretty profound experience for me. I just wanted to begin, first of all, just to flag that if anything that I or anyone else discusses stresses you in any way, just to link into the supports that you have available to you. Now, imagine taking a call from a distressed parent who can't seem to find the whereabouts of their teenager after hearing that a car has been driven through Melbourne City CBD, killing and maiming many, or putting together lists of people who are likely to be killed or injured, and helping police to triage this through the disaster victim identification process. Or finding out that the phone call that you took yesterday, the one that kept you up all night, where you're talking to distressed family members about someone in the Black Saturday bushfires or trying to find their loved one, and you found out when you picked up the morning paper and they'd been identified as one of the deceased, and just think about the impact that might have on someone. These are just some of the many haunting stories that I have heard from past and present Red Cross volunteers and staff who have operated the Register Find Reunite system here in Victoria and across the country. You'll likely be familiar with Register Find Reunite as a system, being the one that's behind the number that flashes up on the news screen to call if you are worried about that your loved one might be impacted by the emergency. It's operated over decades, with Red Cross working alongside police, playing a key role in the identification of victims and reunifying loved ones who have been displaced in emergencies. And what I realized looking at all this is that we don't really fully understand the impact that these interactions and these tasks have on the mental health and the well-being of those who are undertaking this reunification activity. And how can we protect our people if we don't fully understand what that impact is? So with the increased usage of Register Find Reunite, and with many people, including surge staff capacities across the country, in settings such as public areas, relief centres and airports, I wanted to investigate what, in fact, was this mental health impact and the wellbeing impacts for those personnel undertaking the emergency reunification processes. And the Emergency Services Foundation agreed, and I was lucky enough to be granted a scholarship to visit the United Kingdom to understand this all better. So I visited the UK in July last year, as they operate similarly here to Australia with the program called the Casualty Bureau. And they have had that recent and significant experience with those mass casualty events that required a large-scale disaster victim identification response. You would have heard of all of these: the London bombings, the Manchester Arena bombings, the Grenfell Tower tragedy, London Bridge and Westminster Bridge attacks, as well as recent airport reunification activities, such as the MH17 missile attack and the Tunisian mass beach shooting. So through interviews and surveys with agencies such as Disaster Victim Identification UK, the Casualty Bureau, British Red Cross, and London Heathrow Airport, who were chosen because they likely had learnt many lessons in keeping their personnel safe over this time. And I was really keen to discover what these learnings might be and to bring them back here to the sector. Now, what I found not only relates to emergency reunification activities, but could be transferable to many support roles across the emergency response, such as incident management teams, coordination and administrative roles. Initially, one of the biggest paradigm shifts that I had was the use of the language of recovery. Now, we'd all be familiar with the use of recovery, the use of language recovery here in Australia. When we use it, we talk about, we're often talking about people who are directly impacted by the emergency. So someone who might have lost their house in a bushfire, someone who might have been injured in a collective trauma event. But what they do in the UK is that they've flipped this a little bit, and they've talked about first responders and those support roles and how can we plan for their recovery, and looking at what recovery means to the personnel who are attending that same incident. So that was a significant difference that I noticed over there. Now, in terms of emergency reunification, everybody that I spoke to and surveyed was incredibly proud of the part that they played in their response. However, over half, in fact, it was 57% of people had negative impacts to their well-being, with 11% having ongoing and significant impacts. The majority had responded to multiple incidents of these same incidents, increasing the risk of vicarious and cumulative trauma impacts. Being that the jurisdictions are generally state or nation-based, it's the same group of people who are attending the same emergencies behind the scenes. With all of these events which could be deemed as collective trauma events, that vicarious and cumulative trauma element is likely to be exacerbated through media saturation of the event, the demographics of the victims, the likelihood that the call you're taking is a victim. For instance, I heard stories of people taking calls for the Manchester Arena attack, speaking to a family member who was trying to find out about the well-being of a family member who was wearing the same jacket of the kid they just sent to that concert, laying on the ground in the background of the live television footage. And there were several stories of being unable to switch off, obsessively trying to find the outcome of a particularly distressing call. I also was able to proactively identify high-risk roles, and these seem to be based around coordination and administrative roles. Generally, coordinators who are responsible for their team's well-being often overlooked and feel less able to access the same well-being supports that they are promoting to their staff. Administrative roles are also really high risk. For instance, I heard a story of one of my interviewees who now has a really visceral trauma response when coming across lists of names in rosters or wedding seating plan, because in several of these incidents they've been responsible for collating lists of the deceased to help with the disaster victim identification team and the coroner. So collation and data entry can be really deemed as high risk as well. Interestingly, Disaster Victim Identification UK, which is a lead agency over there in these mass casualty events, the first person that they deploy is a wellbeing officer in their IMT structure. And they have accountability of the wellbeing of personnel in the overall response. And they work with their counterparts across agencies to ensure a consistent and an accountable response in regards to personnel wellbeing. And this is something that I strongly recommend in my report, that we take a similar approach here, and we develop protocols to support such a role. Something else that I've recommended that is undertaken in the sector here is trauma risk management, or TRIM. It's a program that is was born out of the UK Defence Force and is was used post-deployment of people coming back from deployments overseas. It's used in almost all of the response agencies in the UK. It's a tried and tested psychologically informed response, and it's using a risk management tool that helps to ID the presence of risk factors for the development of those post-traumatic illnesses. It supports colleagues in the wake of that trauma by identifying those most at risk. And organisationally, it protects staff and allows for that legal duty of care of personnel. Generally, it's rolled out through trained peer practitioners and is managed in-house. And what it does is it really reduces that risk of trauma going unchecked in the organisation, and stops it from becoming an acute or a chronic trauma response. It normalises and destigmatises the response to trauma. It talks a lot about your response to this incident is normal. The incident is in fact abnormal. So it really flips that talk around reactions and trauma on its head a little. It reduces the barriers to help seeking, and it increases organisational mental health literacy and adds to the holistic wellbeing cultures that they have over there in the UK. And TRIM's been a huge part of that. In the UK as well, the wellbeing cultures of these emergency services agencies has shifted significantly. Following a string of mass casualty events, organisations have significantly increased their investment into their wellbeing culture, and this has been also through focusing on resilience building and the recovery of their personnel, the development of a proactive and a reactive processes and systems, ensuring that there's accessible resources for both personnel and their families, and creating strong governance and accountability around wellbeing as a sector and organisationally. Since I've been back, I have generated a report, which, as Susan mentioned, you can find on the ESF website. And since then as well, the Australian Red Cross is undertaking significant improvements into their response and recovery programming, which has been improving the wellbeing outcomes for our personnel. And overall, we are markedly improving our wellbeing culture. Whilst there's still, a way to go, wellbeing is being discussed proactively, and we're being far more likely to identify, have early identification and early intervention of those personnel impacted, which we know is crucially important to a person's recovery. And I have also enrolled in the TRIM program to become a TRIM practitioner, to be able to roll this tried and tested program out through my organisation and across the sector as well. So I'm looking forward to completing that and being able to start to roll this great program out. Now, finally, this scholarship has proven incredibly important. We now have a solid understanding of the impacts this reunification process and the impact of these on the impact to responders in these emergencies. And we've been able to start to implement these improvements we have over the recent summer. We're implementing them for future events that we know we'll see our personnel responding to in mass displacement and mass fatality events. And we know that the next big one is not an if, but a when. So the implementation of sector-wide wellbeing officers and the introduction of trauma risk management, or TRIM, to the sector will help to ensure that the wellbeing of personnel is a priority and is consistently addressed through a strong wellbeing culture across the sector and to protect our people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, T. Craig Shepherd has asked a question here. He said, yeah, well done. He said, you've talked a lot about a whole range of things, but what was the most significant thing you brought back from the UK?
Yeah, the most significant thing in my report, there's a whole load of different policies and processes and systems and things like that, but the most significant was the accountability piece around the sector wellbeing officer. So having a wellbeing officer sitting in the IMT who is accountable for the responses, the personnel included in that response, and who talk to their counterparts who have similar officers in their IMTs as well. So you know, a holistic approach to that response and making sure it's consistent. And the second one was the TRIM training. That was something that was really entrenched in the UK. It's something that every single person I spoke to over there really sung its praises and was the cornerstone piece of their the changes that they had in their wellbeing cultures. So the TRIM training and the wellbeing officer were the two key takeaways for me.
And certainly last summer here, I know there were wellbeing officers in the IMT.
Yeah, I guess it's also around ensuring that that's a consistent approach, and there's protocols and there's processes around that.
Yeah, and today Gary Cook was talking about how CFA is including peers in their deployments to different parts of the state and so forth as well. There's another question coming here. Well, first of all, there's a comment from Cliff Overton saying, fantastic work, it has real relevance for the sector and make a difference. And Neil Bibby asks, great subject, what training does the wellbeing officer have?
Well, I guess that's to be developed. I guess we can look at what our needs are here as a sector and have investment into what that might look like.
Yeah,
as a sector. Yeah.
Another question or a statement from Erin Smith. How did the research change you?
I think this has, for me, I think it's shifted my career trajectory. I was already always interested in this, but now have a really profound passion for this. And personally, I have sustained a workplace mental health injury, and I know just how important this stuff is to get right early on.
Well, thank you, T, and thank you for sharing that with us today. A terrific presentation. We'll come back if there's some more questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks.
So now we're going to go to Marcus Warner, and Marcus is up in the northeast, up in Bright. He's a passionate SES volunteer. And like most of our emergency management volunteers, he's deeply committed to the wellbeing of his community, which happens to be, as I said, up in Bright, which is a beautiful, busy wilderness and tourist destination. And I've jumped off mountains up there in paragliders myself, Marcus. That might surprise you. He doesn't just turn out and go home, though. He worries about how people who have been unwittingly caught up in emergencies are impacted. And Marcus is going to tell us about how a random email changed his life and led to this scholarship. Welcome, Marcus.
Thanks, Susan, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a brief bit of my research with you tonight. And more than happy to expand on it. As a volunteer, I feel very privileged to be a recipient of the Emergency Services Foundation Travel Scholarship. It's something that I recommend to any volunteer who may be watching this to definitely apply for. It's not just for paid emergency services personnel. And I feel very passionate about the fact that as volunteers, we deserve as much support as everyone else in the front line. As Susan said, it really did start as a random message. In fact, it was a Facebook message. As usual, you wake up in the morning, first thing you do is check your Facebook feed. I had a pending message in there, which I found very unusual. I opened this message and it was from a French gentleman asking for my identification. You know, you think that's maybe some sort of spam or looking to get me to send money to Nigeria. In fact, actually, he talked about a very specific rescue I'd involved in. So just to wind the clock back 6 months, in a very hot day in January 2017, we did a typical rescue on Mount Buffalo. Anyone who knows that area really well, it's very, very heavily touristed. I think we've gone 10 years straight in the Bright SES unit that we've had a rescue on Australia Day on Mount Buffalo. So it has a little bit of a reputation. On this occasion, a teenage boy had fallen around about 30 meters and then had sustained some very, very serious injuries. On that day, being a hot day, a lot of people traveled to the area to swim in the rock pools, etc. And approximately 200 people were in that vicinity. Typical turnout for any one of those rescues, about 15 to 20 emergency services personnel, Victoria Police, Ambulance Victoria, the local CFA, the Bright SES unit, and ultimately HEMS came in and flew the casualty to Melbourne. Out of those volunteers, we also have other members turn up. We usually call upon the support of Parks Victoria because these are quite difficult rescues. They're in a wilderness environment. There isn't a lot of infrastructure in place, and there's usually a fairly arduous carry-out. And we can often call upon bystanders to help, especially if there's been a number of casualties involved. Now, this random message was from a gentleman who had been there that day, who had observed and witnessed the actual falling of this person and witnessing of the injuries and the time taken for the rescue to occur. He was there with his young family and his wife. Now, we started a dialogue over a period of initially hours and then led into some days. And to cut a long story short, he had been dramatically impacted psychologically by what he witnessed that day. In fact, he was on a lifetime trip to Australia, was traveling around with his family. He went back to his accommodation in Bright that evening. They packed their bags and they started to make their way home. He never really fully saw the full recovery unfold for him. And so he allowed that to dwell on him for quite a considerable time. And as we know, around the impact of PTSD, that if we don't get early intervention, these things can lead to quite a disruptive element of people's lives. He returned to France. He lived near Lyon. He used to take his children, who are teenagers and young children, out into the mountains. Since he had returned, he never went out into the mountains again. He was that scared. So it started to have a material impact on his family. I reached out to him. I couldn't do a lot from this end, but I did have some contacts in France and I got him some medical support. And we've been in touch ever since, and he helped to his road of recovery. So that side of the question that I really felt, well, is this just a one-off? I asked around, as you do as a volunteer, you ask your peer group, you know, has this happened before? And interestingly enough, very quickly uncovered that, of course, you know, a lot of people are observing traumatic events. So my research started with desk research, as you normally do. You know, unbeknownst to most, 40 to 45% of the global population will witness some form of dramatic, traumatic event in their lifetime, of which 25 to 30% will go on to develop some form of PTSD. So obviously, as a unit in Bright, we offer a number of services, including road crash. We have fairly good training and collateral in place to deal with road crash, along with a lot of the other emergency services around Australia who deal with major traumatic events. And that collateral is often things such as incident cards and the ability for people to go out and seek additional support. But obviously that doesn't exist in a wilderness environment. So my research took me to the ESF, and I was lucky to be given a scholarship to travel. The main areas I wanted to look at is there a common platform that people can rely on to actually put in place some form of post-trauma counselling that may occur for those who are unwitting witnesses to major traumatic events. In a nutshell, there isn't anything that is consistent across the sector. You can start with very large mass casualty events, as T's referred to, such as the Burke Street, where you have a disparate proportion of population of people coming together, but you have a fairly robust infrastructure in place, such as technology. So a lot of the people who witnessed that incident and other mass casualty incidents around the world, they often track down through technology. They often go back to their place of abode and can be contacted. And there was obviously a lot of research in that place. For my research, we found that on mass casualty events that occur in wilderness areas, that doesn't occur. We often see 1 or 2 single occupants being injured, but a lot of witnesses. That may occur on such places such as Bondi Beach. So I reached out to the Surf Lifesaving Australia, and they often have a fairly high profile. They work alongside the people who witness drownings and other incidents on the beaches on a very busy day. But how does that translate into the more rural and remote regions? So I turned my attention to where does this have the most maturity and where is the biggest background in arduous environmental rescues that are occurring outside of metropolitan areas. And that is ultimately in places such as mountain ranges and very, very largely visited national parks around the world. So my research took me to Europe and the UK, where there are some very robust and very mature rescue agencies. Some of them run by both civil defence or defence agencies, and some obviously paid professionals and volunteers. The scope of my research was really to sit down with these agencies and see what do they do. Do they do anything differently to what we do in our part of the world? And ultimately, they do quite a lot of different things. In the base research that I did in the mountain rescue environment, a lot of the rescues that occurred there, the rescue agencies already have in place a structure where the individuals who are obviously first impacted, the casualties, are removed from the scene, usually through some form of medevac. But more importantly, everyone in the party involved and anyone who may be witness to that is also removed from the scene. They find that if they don't do that, they will be called back to that scene sometime later, sometimes later that night, where those people who may have observed something on a glacier or up on a mountain range have come to terms with what's happened. Shock has set in. They're in the fatigued state as well as a mentally stressed state, and therefore they call for help. So the agencies that I spend a lot of time with, the mountain rescue agencies, find that it's better off to remove everyone from the scene, but at the same time also to give them some robust counselling and give them some opportunities. At the same time, in some of these heavily touristed wilderness areas, they also have infrastructure in place at the tourist level. So the local mayors and the local tourist agencies will also be informed that a major event has occurred in the mountains that day, because obviously people see a lot of the activity. They see the helicopters, they see the mountain rescue teams rolling out. So when people return to their accommodation at the end of the evening, there is something in place for them. Often the community talk about it. They're very, very proud of what the work is being done. So what I was observing in these interviews is that very quickly that there is a great pride in the town for what they do to help tourists and to rehabilitate them and rescue the tourists. But more importantly, they actually put an arm around them and actually give them some form of collateral. Now, whether that is actually the opportunity to sit down and talk about it or give them some form of professional help. But that often occurs on a daily basis and is quite formalized and quite structured. So as part of my research, I looked at whether we can ultimately come up with a set of guidelines that we can roll out to parts of our emergency services sector here in Australia that would be then consistent. And as T said in her presentation around the large mass casualty events, it's about the consistency and having that happening at every single opportunity. And I've noticed over the decade that I've been involved in rescues that it's a bit more ad hoc. Sometimes we have very good incident agency commanders and we have very good VicPol on scene, and the police are very good at putting a lot of structure in place, but often we're very time poor, and often from a volunteer base, it's not at top of mind, and so these things can disappear. So the aims of the research are ultimately to look at, are there a set of guidelines that are transferable to the Australian sector? Look at some of the approaches, as we know from the research into PTSD and mental health first aid, early intervention is key, and what can we do there? And can we draw any comparisons to what is happening in the global arena and in a cost-effective and simple approach, roll that out to the Australian sector? I conducted 68 interviews, and you know, incredibly, all of them see this as a major challenge around the world, because the world is becoming a smaller place. Obviously, 2020 has put a huge stop on global travel, but up until then, and it will obviously return, is that people are getting out into the wilderness. So these sorts of events will occur more often, and therefore we need to have some form of guidelines. The other things we notice is that there's a greater awareness of the activities being done in more remote and regional and wilderness areas around the world. So in the UK, for example, where we have some of the oldest established mountain rescue agencies, they're actually part of their OOO, or Emergency Services Network. So if you were to ring 999 in the UK, you get 5 choices: police, ambulance, fire, Coast Guard, or mountain rescue. And obviously that's under the guidance of the police, but obviously people know that there is an opportunity to reach out for somebody who's specialist in that field. The moment a mountain rescue occurs, and through that cascade from the moment the OOO or the 999 call comes in, those respondents know that there is an event occurring that requires a larger than just a single casualty or casualties, but a larger arena that they're going to be working in. And so they're already prepared for it. So that's quite mature and quite well established. Secondly, a lot of these mountain rescue agencies are actually quite high profile. In France, for example, they're run by the military. They're some of the most elite police and military academies are the mountain rescue, and they put a lot of work into their community engagement. So local festivals, local fetes, any opportunity during sporting events for them to demonstrate what they do, because they feel that education of around what is occurring in a very traumatic arena, whether it's someone, you know, bringing somebody out on a stretcher or coming in on a cable on a helicopter. A lot of people stop to watch, but they don't really know what's going on. So in Europe, they find education to the public is really critical. And in some cases, because they're so high profile, they've actually been making television shows. So the awareness of what goes on at an event is very similar to what we see on Australian television here, where people are seeing what happens at road crash or in the emergency department, but we very rarely see much of this happening in the wilderness area. So one of the areas that we want to work on is obviously in that space of education. So in conclusion, my findings really looked at a number of recommendations. One is obviously in the first responders. When we respond as a group of volunteers and or our professional rescue, we need to have in place a structure that knows that there are multiple witnesses to this event and they will be impacted. Whether we like it or not, we have a duty of care to more than just the casualty. And so that onus lies really tactically on the incident commander or somebody appointed in that role. We also need to have better training. As volunteers, that is something we don't get in our standard training package to roll out in an orange uniform or a blue uniform as a volunteer in the wilderness area. We're more focused about how we handle the casualty or technically do the rescue. We also need to look at educating the general public more. There are traumatic events, but the more we can tell people about what is occurring and give them that follow-up, they're more likely to be able to deal with it or at least seek help. Looking at what we can do in Emergency Management Victoria, just looking at the way that OOO takes that call. Are there other people in the arena? How many people are on the mountain that day? If there's hundreds of people, that can be very traumatic, and we need to be made aware of that when the first OOO call comes in. Working up here in the local agencies with the tourist boards and the local council, we're already understanding that as a tourist town, we have an obligation to our visitors, and therefore, similar to what I found in Europe, they actually do spend a lot of time reaching out, making sure maybe it's a simple text message or an email sent to the bulk of the accommodation providers that something really tragic happened in the mountains today. And if you see any of your visitors or any of your guests exhibiting any symptoms, let's talk about it. Let's get them some help. And as an SAS unit, we feel that we really could champion our cause and really drive this, because this is an area that we feel we could own as much as any other agency. So since I've got back, we've started to do this at a very much a grassroots level. I've sort of exhibited some of these behaviors in front of my colleagues, and I've been on a number of rescues since I got back, where alongside my Ambulance Victoria colleagues, the Victoria Police colleagues, and more recently our Fire Rescue Victoria colleagues up here in the mountains, we've actually proactively gone out to help those witnesses who have been observing those and actually give them some guidance and some counselling. And it's been met really in such a positive way. I had my reservations that I could go to a fellow colleague from another emergency services and say, look, I know we've just done something fairly arduous and we're all putting slapping each other on the back for a great job, but we do need to take care of everyone else, not just ourselves, has been met with a fantastic level of feedback. So I'm really excited. COVID stopped a few of my little pilots, but one of the pilots I am about to conduct is with the Alpine Shire Council, where we're actually going to start working with our tourist bodies, because obviously we're one of the most visited towns in Victoria and in Australia. And the northeast of Victoria over the next 2 years is going to see an unprecedented volume of tourists coming from all over the country, as obviously travel takes its time to get back on its feet. So we're going to see more of these events. The selfie culture, people taking more risks, getting out into the wilderness is going to happen, and therefore what they're going to be exposed to ultimately will lead to some form of challenge and potential tragic accidents, and we need to be prepared for that. So I'm very privileged to be involved in this sort of research. There's lots of tie-ins with what my colleagues are doing in the more metropolitan, the more established areas, and so I've been great listening to their conversations and their research and taking little snippets from it. But I still believe there's more work to do, and you know, I still see this as a work in progress for all of us, both myself as an individual, my unit, but more importantly as an emergency services sector. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'll keep up the good work.
And indeed, it is great work, Marcus. You've done a fantastic job. Just one quick question here from another very passionate SES volunteer, Karina Newton. She's clearly read your report, and she said that you talk about the influence of media in these mountain rescues. Can you briefly just tell us about that?
Yes, I was lucky. Obviously, you could tell from my accent. I'm English. I have some colleagues who work in television back in the UK. The BBC and Channel 4 have both put a lot of work into television shows exploring the remit of different rescue agencies. So there are shows in the UK that play out on mainstream TV. Friday night, 7 o'clock at night, was a show called The Mountain, where they followed people's lives through some of the most touristed mountains, Mount Snowdonia in Wales and Ben Nevis in Scotland. And people are aware of what goes on. But also the media that I spoke to, I sat down to talk to a number of people within the Swiss media, the French media, and the Italian media, and their obligation by their local journalists is to actually talk about what happened in their town or village that week or that month during those rescues. So, for example, in a town such as Chamonix, it's obviously one of the most famous ski towns in the world. Their online presence, their Chamonix.com, basically, their website has a dedicated media journalist who follows all of the rescues that occur and does a very factual write-up about what occurs. I follow those feeds. I read them with great interest, but they really do tell people what occurred, because there's that great unknown. When you see a helicopter fly over and there's something slung underneath it, is that person alive? Did they make it to hospital? What occurred there? Those linger with people. So the media are very, very important in this, in terms of both how they cover a rescue. For example, we often get approached after a rescue on Mount Buffalo by the media, and obviously they're looking quite often for a blame culture. The ones that we often rescue, it's tragically, it is people taking a selfie. They are climbing over barriers. They are doing ultimately the wrong thing, but it is an accident. We can't judge those. And as emergency services professionals and volunteers, we shouldn't judge. We're there to do the best by what we've got. And therefore the media have an obligation to try to portray that in a much more factual way, to give people that, because otherwise the blame culture occurs. And then you get this situation where if the media are driving that, it's the same as cyclists being hit on roads. We should ban cyclists. We should then, make them pay regio. They shouldn't be. We'll start banning people going into the mountains, and that then leads to people taking greater riskier behavior, in my belief. So media is an important one, and knowing the work that Katrina's been doing and the role that expos and just showing different communities what we can do is critical. I think that just education is the key to this one.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. As a communications person, you've given me some ideas that will make some people shake, I'm sure. But anyway, we'll see what happens. We're going to go to Dennis Smith now. Now, Dennis is with Fire Rescue Victoria, and he's an acting commander. He probably doesn't fit the stereotype of the sort of bloke you'd expect to chill out with meditation, but he does. And he's found it so beneficial that he started to think about how it could help people in high stress roles in the emergency services, not just to build resilience, but to improve cognitive function. And a stint in the State Control Centre got him thinking, and it led him to an Emergency Services Foundation scholarship. I'll let Dennis tell you more.
Thanks very much, Susan, and thanks ESF. Really appreciate the opportunity to tell my story, and also to for being one of the scholarship, one of many great people, I guess, and in particular this group here and past scholarship awardees. Just to be part of that group, it's quite humbling. So I appreciate the opportunity. So as Susan said, I spent a bit of time at the State Control Centre over a couple of summers a few years ago in the Emergency Management Liaison Department, and I was able to, that along with coordinating a lot of deployments in and out of the country and the state. So I was able to see a lot of really high-stressed individuals in some really high-end roles, and most of them leadership roles, although these roles were covered through support roles, even back at agency roles as well. But in particular, I was focusing on incident controller, incident control centre roles, level 3 incident controllers, the state response controllers, those leadership roles that ultimately are working in a high stress environment over long periods of time, often fatigued, and in situations where they have to make some really enhanced decisions quite quickly, and obviously with a lot of knowledge and memory recall needed for these particular incidents. And I could see that they were really focused on their people on the ground and the safety of their people on the ground, their well-being of people on the ground, because that was their job. And it sort of made me wonder who's looking after these people and who's making sure they're working at a high capacity. And it just felt like being in leadership roles, sometimes they can often get missed. So that, along with my own personal experience with undertaking mindfulness techniques, it made me think, I wonder if something like this could be brought into emergency services, in particular for those roles, but it could eventually cover all aspects and all roles within the emergency sector. And I wondered what the appetite would be like. So I did some investigation around Victoria first, and what I was positive to find out that Victoria Police had some involvement with mindfulness, and there was a component in their promotional courses where they did. I guess the concept was brought to the promotional courses, although there wasn't a formal technique program throughout that course, but it showed me that if Victoria Police are open to the concept, that really gave me an insight that maybe the other agencies might be open to this as well. And at the moment, or at the time, there wasn't a huge amount in the other agencies in Victoria, let alone Australia. So it made me look overseas, and I could see that the States and Canada seem to have, most of the research I found, seem to have quite a few agencies involved with either programs that have been implemented completely, or had just done pilot programs recently that made some of these research papers that I was reading. And I was able to identify a few particular places, which led for the further investigation. And I was able to get some information from universities, neuroscientists, and the agencies involved, and find out a little bit more about their programs. Now, I want to sort of go back a little step. Now, mindfulness techniques, it is really, it's an exercise. It's not necessarily, a lot of people think of meditation as relaxing, and although there are some meditations that can relax the mind, mindfulness meditation is more of an exercise to focus the mind. And that's what really appealed to me. I thought, well, there is a large mental health aspect to it as well, and well-being, but there's also the building of cognitive performance. So the research out there suggests that it actually reduces the amygdala, which is the stress part of the brain, because your brain learns how to stress less, and you have less of that fight or flight mode mechanism. And the prefrontal cortex part of the brain gets thicker, and that's the part of the brain that looks after awareness, concentration and decision making. So this is the science behind it, and it's that sort of information. I thought, well, that's probably the way to sell this quite a progressive technique to emergency services organisations, because I know a lot of us are analytical thinkers and we need to know the science behind it. but not only that, we needed data to prove that it actually works. So when I went and visited these countries, I was able to see the results and see how these programs were implemented and the types of programs that were implemented. And the research that I found out was evident that a teacher-led program face-to-face worked better than most over a period of time. And this is all obviously in my recommendations, but just the things I found in particular were if you actually have a program that goes for 3, 4, 5 weeks, you can get into more of a habit, because something like mindfulness meditation can be easily done for a week or 2, but then you've dropped it. It's almost like an exercise. You go to the gym, you go for a run. If you get into a routine, you can keep on doing it. And once you know the techniques and the tools, it can become a weekly or daily exercise, which then allows people to make it part of their life. Now, these techniques only take 10 minutes or so once learnt, and it could even take 1 minute, to be perfectly honest. You can do it anywhere, anytime, and that's the key point. Once people learn the science behind it and be educated about it, in particular these emergency services places, or agencies I should say, it gave them the tools and techniques to be able to use these exercises throughout their daily period, throughout their work day, before they go to work, when they get home from work. So we've got police, corrections, fire agencies, the US Army, New Zealand Air Force and Homeland Security were the main agencies over there. And as I mentioned before, some of them had just recently done pilot programs. Some of them have actually embedded these programs into their agencies. So I wanted to find out how did you get them embedded? How do they work? Because I could see that there's some programs that could be trialled and then maybe dropped because there's not enough either funding, or it's not embedded in a way that there's longevity in these programs. So some of the recommendations that I've got in there from what I found is that I believe that Victorian emergency management sector needs to work collaboratively to implement or give a pilot teacher-led program in place covering all agencies initially. And I wanted to focus the pilot programs on the either incident controller type roles or field commanders, or both, and potentially a few people from each agency over a 4 to 6 week period. And I also suggested that in order to prove that this works, not just to say, hey, this was great, it's a great program, speak to a couple of people, I want to make sure there's proper data involved. So I suggested that we get a university involved as well that can evaluate officially the trial and ensure we've got the data to back us up, to make sure that we can say, hey, this has worked. It's increased the cognitive performance, it's reduced anxiety, it's reduced fatigue, it's reduced burnout. It's sort of those sort of things we need to say to the agencies, hey, we've got these people at these high-end roles, generally high-stressed, and predominantly and historically, some of these people have got a history of working in the areas where they've been involved with a lot of traumatic incidents throughout their working career. So there's a lot of things being built up there, and we need to get them to a point where they've got some resilience to not allow them to get lost in the moment in a high stressful situation. They can keep focused. When they do go home to sleep, they can sleep properly, and they come to work fully functioning and been able to have these tools to make sure that they work stronger, they think stronger, and they're able to work at a high performance in those high stressful situations. Another thing that I was able to identify, that it really was important that the space for these courses in particular, that it wasn't done in our agency's room. As an example, the fire agency, where you've got tones and things going off, has to be a separate location and venue just for that training period. Now that's changed, because since I came back and I've given these recommendations, there's a slight change to that, because COVID has happened since then, and that's my recommendations were classroom situation, face-to-face. It is only 1 hour once a week for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. So it's not a huge amount of time, but I know to get these people in the room can be quite hard, especially if they've got these leadership roles. So I know Susan and I were chatting, and we were sort of discussing, look, COVID's changed. Can we actually have a face-to-face version and maybe an online version? And so that's part of the process now. Concept is for the pilot, and also we want to make sure we can evaluate both different versions. We want to evaluate what's the face-to-face version of this mindfulness program, and what's the online version, but still teacher-led, still face-to-face, but online, so it can reach people. They can do it from their homes, they can do it from their regional area that they're working. So we're able to contact Dr. Richard Chambers, who's a clinical psychologist and a mindfulness consultant. And I think with him, we're able to contextualise a program specifically for emergency services personnel. And that was one key item that I found out. These programs that are everywhere around the globe aren't really contextualised specifically for emergency services personnel. And it really does work a whole lot better when you've got someone who knows the work that we do, who knows the stresses that we come against, and can formulate a program specifically for us and help us in these times. In the meantime as well, with Susan's help, during the COVID period, we're able to use Richard's assistance. He was able to formulate some mindfulness videos for a number of people in Victoria, and I believe there's even some people from interstate as well who've used these mindfulness meditation videos to help people get through this period. Now, that wasn't part of my recommendations at all, but what it did show is that maybe if this was brought to the table a year or two ago, I don't think it would have had as much appetite. But I think since COVID, mental health and well-being is obviously on the forefront of everyone's mind, and progressive programs like this, which normally might not be taken up, are definitely getting looked at. And I do think that now's the time to use an evidence-based progressive program to assist all the emergency services to get through periods, not only of COVID-19, but we've just got off the back of an extremely busy fire period. And each year there's always going to be something. And these people are always going to be working high stressful situations, always fatigued with the risk of burnout, the risk of anxiety, and having people have tools in their back pocket to be able to use to get them through these periods, to make sure that they're making enhanced decisions, their cognitive performance as high as it can be during these high stressful situations. So that's where the report took me. As I said, we've made a concept to get the pilots up. Obviously, once we get to a point where we can get this funded, we'll start to contact the agencies and get approval to be able to get people to be involved. And as we mentioned before, we'll get a university involved as well, just so they can collect the data, and that'll form further research papers as well for the mindfulness field out there, and in particular for the emergency services personnel. And perhaps this is something that can be used interstate. If it's a program that another state might want to pick up, they might be able to pick it up as well. Being online, that's obviously a lot more accessible for a lot more agencies and personnel. And there is a potential that there could be a train-the-trainer model involved as well. And that was another thing that was proven that was successful overseas, that if it was a strong enough program, that if a train-the-trainer model could actually allow some internal people within the agency to deliver these programs. So that's what I got out of it, and that's what the report hopefully will allow us to make some positive change in the way we try to build the resilience for the emergency services personnel. And I believe programs like this will give us that opportunity, and a reasonably, I guess it's not going to be an overly expensive program, and it could be something that can be used more and more over the years once you learnt that initial technique that, as we said before, you could be used anytime, anywhere. All you need is 1 minute, but generally a 10-minute break is often all you need to be able to go through a mindfulness period and build your resilience that way. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, Dennis. And I'm pleased to say that as I was working this afternoon, we had our 800th download of the mindfulness tapes. So that's pretty amazing. It's fantastic. Now, there's been a question here from Kate Siebert, and she said she's worked in the State Control Centre on many occasions, and it's great that there's a chill-out room there now. But do you envisage a time, perhaps before the morning briefing, where there's a 5-minute mindfulness session for everyone?
Yeah, that's an absolute possibility. You have to be aware as well, some people find that moment quite a private moment as well, but I have seen it done quite a few times, and in particular overseas in these places, they do group meditations, and they even have rooms, probably not in that particular industry, but I did visit Google as well. I know they're a completely different organisation, but they've got a room set up a little bit bigger than the one at State Control Centre. But it is a room where anyone can go at any period of time that is set up purely for meditation and to go through those techniques. But Kate, to answer your question, I think before before your shift starts, absolutely. Even if it's as your team, if you've got a room to go to as well, it can be done with the whole group, I guess, at the State Control Centre. But as a minimum, I think a team, all you need is to go into a room for 5 minutes, because it will absolutely clear your head and get you set up for that shift, which will no doubt be extremely busy. And I've done time up there where you literally, you don't have time to think. And if you set yourself up properly at the start, it will assist you through that whole period, I'm sure, as a tool.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. We might bring everyone just back up on screen while I do a bit of a wrap up. I've got a couple of questions here, and one is from everybody needs to put their video back on, please. All of the panelists now. This is a question from Craig Shepherd, and he, as you know, is the chair of the scholarship committee. And he wants to know, now you've completed the scholarship, how would you describe the journey? What was the most wonderful thing for you about getting a scholarship? Greg, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think for me, Susan, mine probably came more so on return from the scholarship. What I've really, really enjoyed is like a collaborative team effort around this, working with everyone from across the actual sector. This is not just a Victoria Police initiative or a Victoria Police idea. This is an emergency service sector idea. And I've really enjoyed that camaraderie and the collaborative approach to looking at what we're trying to implement. And I think the other thing too is, most of us have a suite of services across the sector that provide clinical therapies to deal with mental health. But I think if we can get into also supplying the holistic approach as well, it just absolutely adds to the suite of services that we have, and it will just be great for the whole sector.
Thank you, Greg. T, what did you get out of the scholarship beyond what you learnt personally?
I had some really big moments while I was over there, I guess, sitting over the other side of the world, talking with heads of agencies and people who have been through the same problems that we're facing here in this sector and have come up with solutions, and having really profound and interesting conversations that has built really strong connections between agencies here, between myself and those agencies, and being able to continue to connect in with those people when we come up with a problem. And every time there's been an incident either here or in the UK, we're always reaching out to see if they're okay. So had some really great connections and some profound moments there.
So you've got a real open door policy now with some experts elsewhere. That's great. Marcus, what about you? What did you get personally out of the scholarship?
I think there's two things. One was the discipline of actually taking what I thought was just a personal problem that kept me awake at night and was only shared by myself, and actually translating into that something more meaningful that, allowed others across the sector and across all emergency services around the world to share in. So the recipients, when I went to interview them, were just as passionate, but they hadn't really thought about it in such a structured way. And then more importantly, coming home and actually just having people who've read my paper from all walks of life just coming up to me, putting a hand on my shoulder saying, great work, it's right under our nose all along. We depart the scene, don't think anything more about it. But those people go back to their accommodation or back home or travel on an aeroplane back to their country and go, how was your trip to Australia? It didn't end so well. And that's what's I found so fascinating, is that other agencies that I work alongside with, both as volunteer and as professionals, have actually, it's resonated with them. And it was there literally all along under their nose, but I've just put a little bit of structure around it maybe.
Fantastic. Dennis, a slightly different question for you. What advice would you give to other people embarking on future research like this or applying for a scholarship?
I think do your own research first, I guess, to see what else is out there. There could be things that you haven't realised that might be in place even in your own state, let alone your own country. But I found it really important to do as much information research as possible, but also connecting in with your people here, because they might give you some further ideas. And not only that, it's the people that have gone through the process. Make sure you connect in with them, because they can assist you with preparing for the process and making sure you've got a succinct idea that you're going to actually write about. And that might change over time. So the more you research, the more you might sort of change it slightly. You might start off with one idea and it might grow or actually get sharper. So just keep that in mind. But I know that at the end you want a succinct idea, and you want it to be able to be something you can actually research properly and bring back the information, and hopefully it can be implemented in those agencies. But networking, research, and keep your ideas succinct.
Well, these scholarships are more than just a travel perk, and we often find that people will come into the scholarship process and they haven't done that research, Dennis, and they come in and start talking to the committee, and we might look at each other and think, but hang on a minute, this has been done before. Have you even spoken to this person in your own organisation? So that's a really, really important point. And I've got a question here from Tony Pierce, and he said in relation to all of your topics, where is this question? Just a moment. First of all, he said, well done, great presentations. And he was wondering whether or not any of you saw any evidence of the programs that you'd been working on that had been used to assist with the potential collateral mental health damage that might be experienced by partners and families of emergency service people. So, Marcus, you're talking about the witnesses. What about the partners of people? When you go home at the end of a shift and you've been involved in something.
That was a really interesting side observation from my studies, is that in the European agencies, the rescue agencies, I actually had more to share with them about what we have in place here back in Victoria. So as a member of the Victorian State Emergency Service, our peer support is fantastic because it allows me and my family and my colleagues to reach out. We utilise it a lot. I have utilised it, and we do check in with our partners. Interesting enough, when I was overseas, especially with the more military-based or police-based rescue agencies, they had very little infrastructure. They had an enormous infrastructure to help with the witnesses and the casualties, but they themselves are often neglected. So I think personally that we're doing very well as a service here in Victoria relative to what I observed overseas. So interesting enough, I feel we could reciprocate, and in fact I have continued that dialogue with them and shared with them some of the things we've got in place here with Vic SES.
Greg, would you like to comment about the concept for the Wellbeing Centre and involving the significant others?
Sure, Susan. I did mention it briefly in my presentation. Part of the program that we've drafted actually includes involving partners, significant others as well. I know from a Victoria Police perspective, when I came back from my Churchill, that was one of the things that I found and was a recommendation, that we really need to improve education of our loved ones. It doesn't happen a very limited extent, and I think we need to really get our families and our loved ones on board, because they will then vicariously become part of the team that helps everyone look after each other. And that's why we want to involve the partners and the significant others in the wellbeing program.
Thank you, Greg. I think we're going to have to leave it there, but I'll just say thank you to Ty, Greg, Dennis and Marcus, for very worthy scholarship recipients. Sadly, at this point in time, we would normally present you with a certificate, but I'll have to say it's in the mail, and I'm not telling fibs, it really is. If you're a leader of one of these people watching today, I'm sure you're very proud. If you're a colleague, I hope you're inspired. And if you're an ESF supporter, I'm confident that you're certainly impressed. The reports are on the ESF website, and if you know someone who missed this conversation, we'll also have this on the ESF website as soon as we possibly can. So Next week, the EMC conference is back again on Tuesday and Wednesday. It was absolutely terrific the last 2 days. So if you haven't registered, you might want to do that and catch up with what's going on. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight, and I'll say good night.